In the last video, I was talking about how British society was built upon Christian ideas of virtue, and how if we abandon Jesus and his teaching, our country is going to collapse and fall into the hands of tyrants. Now, I recently came across this clip from Jonathan Haidt, and it speaks more into this issue, but from more of an American perspective. I think it might be really helpful if we dig into what he's saying here, so here's the clip.
No, that's right. So one of the things I'm very concerned about, I'm very concerned, I think you guys have talked about this too, is the difficulty of having a large, diverse, secular society. Human groups, we evolved in fission fusion communities. We're very good at coming together to fight another group, but once we reach a certain size, we tend to split. Civilization is a way of having much, much larger groups, traditionally united by shared gods, shared blood, and shared enemies. That's the human way. That's been true for 5,000 years. So you can have civilizations based on shared gods, shared blood, shared enemies, and those can be very stable for many generations. But in the West, we developed these liberal democracies. And as an American, I'd like to take credit. I mean, there are earlier democracies, but I'll take credit for, our founding fathers were incredibly wise political philosophers. They read history. They were amazing social psychologists. They knew that democracy is unstable because people are passionate and the people can't just rule themselves. You can't have direct democracy. But let's come up with a system where you don't have direct democracy, but yet the people can throw them out of power. The people ultimately can say, no, we don't like this. So they set up this elaborate, almost like an elaborate clock with, counterweights and gears and pulleys. And at the time, Ben Franklin said, he was asked the famous line, he was asked, what kind of government have you given us? And he says, a republic, if you can keep it. Meaning, if the people have sufficient virtue to keep this going, you can keep it. But if the people don't have certain virtues, then this thing is going to fall apart.
What the American founding fathers understood as scholars of antiquity was that historically, democratic republics don't tend to last. In fact, they often eventually end up sliding into authoritarianism. This was the case with ancient Rome, for example, which began as a republic in 509 BC, one of the earliest forms of representative democracy in the world. But in the passing of time, there was a gradual erosion and then collapse of democratic values until 27 BC, when Julius and Augustus Caesar ushered in authoritarian rule. The founding fathers were not just scholars of antiquity, but human nature also. As Jonathan Haidt says, they were good social psychologists, and so they understood the reason for that slide was essentially what the Bible calls the sinful human nature, this propensity that human beings have towards self-interest. When a populace becomes consumed by immorality, greed, and selfish ambition, any form of democracy will soon collapse. And so, although they built checks and balances into their system, they were adamant that for their system of government to work, the people would need to be virtuous. John Adams says, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." So what he's saying is human beings are naturally sinful. They're prone to avarice and selfish ambition. And unless you have some kind of moral bridle on that sin, this system that we've devised isn't going to last. They built in checks and balances into the American Constitution to stop it happening as much as possible. But ultimately, they understood that they were placing the hope for their nation into the hands of the people, the American people, and none of these checks and balances would work in the long run if the people themselves weren't essentially virtuous. Eric Metaxas explains, by itself, the Constitution could do very little. What it promised would require the efforts of all those who henceforth called themselves Americans. It was they who must keep it, the Republic, and the grand and noble promise of that Republic. That is the wonderful, spectacular genius of it all, and the terrible, sobering danger of it all too. The document and the men who created it put these unimaginably great and fragile things in the hands of the people. So these things, still unimaginably great and fragile, are in our hands now, this minute. We ourselves themselves this moment are the keepers of the flame of liberty, and the ones charged by Franklin and the other founders and by history, past, present, and future, with the keeping of this grand promise to the world. This idea that free democracy depends on the virtue of its citizens has been known more widely for quite a long time now. Edmund Burke said it this way. He said, "Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites, in proportion as their love of justice is above their rapacity, in proportion as their soundness and sobriety of understanding is above their vanity and presumption, in proportion as they are more disposed to listen to the counsels of the wise and good, in preference to the flattery of knaves." Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. He continued, "True religion, then, is the foundation of society. When that is once shaken by contempt, the whole fabric cannot be stable or lasting." Benjamin Franklin again said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become more corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." The Spanish philosopher Juan Donoso Cortés said, "There are only two possible forms of control, one internal and religious, and the other external and political, religious and political control. They are of such a nature that when the internal religious barometer rises, the external political barometer falls. And likewise, when the internal religious barometer falls, the external political barometer, that is political control and tyranny, rises. That is the law of humanity, a law of history. If civilized man falls into disbelief and immorality, the way is prepared for some gigantic and colossal tyrant, universal and immense." Benjamin Rush said, "The only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty. And liberty is the object in life of all republican governments. We waste so much time and money in punishing crimes and take so little pains to prevent them. We profess to be republicans, and yet we neglect the only means of establishing and perpetuating our republican forms of government, that is, the universal education of our youth in the principles of Christianity by means of the Bible. For this divine book above all others favors that equality among mankind, that respect for just laws." So from the people who helped to found Western civilization, we get this repeated warning echoing through history that if you want free, civilized society, and if you want to keep it into the future, it rests on you remaining a virtuous people. If you won't be virtuous, then you won't be free. And that's fundamentally why our civilizations are collapsing today, because we started abandoning God, abandoning Christ, abandoning churches, abandoning the Bible, and ultimately abandoning virtue. We're gradually seeing a rise of immorality, vice, corruption, tyranny, suppression of free speech, a loss of trust in politicians, the judiciary, and ultimately we're seeing a rise of tyranny. There's a rising feeling that it's no longer a government of the people, by the people, for the people, but a government of the elites, by the elites, for the elites, and the people are just pawns in their games. And so we see in the Western world that we have a stark choice in front of us today. We can either choose God or choose slavery, choose Christ or choose tyranny. Our freedom has been founded upon Christianity. It was truly Jesus Christ who set us free. But if we want to stay free, we need to come back to him. United States, everyone who hears this message around the world, get down on your knees in repentance today. Fill your churches, sell out every bookstore of every Bible and imbibe its wisdom. Teach others across the land and across the world what it means to be Christ-like. Spread this word across the land, and just maybe there might be some hope. But I say it again, Jesus Christ is the only hope we have. He is the foundation of our freedom and the source of our blessing. You need to come to Jesus Christ today.